I'm Nataliya Shpylova-Saeed. It's my great pleasure to speak today with Halyna Kruk about her poetry collection, A Crash Course in Molotov Cocktails, translated from the Ukrainian into English by Emilia Glaser and Yulia Ilchuk. This poetry collection is published this spring by Arrowsmith Press. I would like to introduce Halyna Kruk first. She is the author of 5 books of poetry, a collection of short stories, and 4 children's books. She has garnered multiple awards for her writing, including the Привітання життя and Грануслов prizes in 1997, the Step-by-Step prize for children's books in 2003, the Book Forum Best Book Award in 2021, the Small Skip Poetry Award, the Bogdan Igor Antonovich Prize Award, the Granuslov Award, and the Kovalyev Foundation Prize for Prose in 2022. Her work has been translated into over 30 languages, and she has translated from several languages into Ukrainian. Halyna Kruk has recently collaborated on poetry music projects with electronic musician Yurko Yefremov and the singer Halyna Breslavets. She served as vice president of the Ukrainian PEN, holds a PhD in Ukrainian literature, and is professor of European and Ukrainian Baroque literature at the Ivan Franko National University in Lviv. Also, our conversation today will be facilitated by our wonderful interpreter, Yuri Mazur. Hello, Halyna, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Доброго дня.
Good day.
So I would like to start with the praise for the book that was written by Peter Balakan. Halyna Kruk has found a language to ingest violence and horror, blunt and eloquent, witty and aphoristic. Her language is layered and electric as it takes on the daily dislocations of Russia's barbaric war on Ukraine. Idiosyncratic and universal, these poems bring us necessary news as only poetry can. But in this context, I would like to mention your words, which you mentioned during one of the public speeches in Berlin, when you pointed out that poetry today is probably not as helpful, particularly when tanks run over the cars, when someone is trying to save their kids who are in the car. So my question will be about the role and the function of poetry today, particularly when we are witnessing this barbaric assault on Ukraine, and at the same time we're witnessing how bravely the Ukrainians are resisting this Russia's assault.
Так, я пригадую цю промову на
Yes, I remember that speech at Berlin Poetic Festival, and in fact, it has been a bit aggressive. I would even say it's provocative, because it was finalized with a phrase that I said, "It's a pity poetry is not killing." Because poetry really cannot help us at the battlefield in the direct sense of the word. It does not repel the bullets, it does not resurrect the perished, and unfortunately it cannot protect the people who are under missiles or rockets. But poetry now in Ukraine is still playing a certain role. It helps us to some extent, and there are several functions in that. First, I may say that it is helping us emotionally to register this reality, to register our feelings, how we live through the war, how we react and respond against it, because our feelings and our perception of what is going on, what is happening, can be forgotten very quickly, and then we just cannot remember how it used to be. Even when I try to memorize the first days after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, my first impressions are still distorted by the following impressions. So this reality is becoming a bit vague and distorted. On the other hand, poetry, and we can see it now very well, helps in lots of other issues to cope, or I would say even first to express our trauma and to see those feelings. It helps not only the authors but the people who are reading. So we may say that now we are feeling this kind of an outburst of attention to the people in Ukraine in different forms of poetry, which is not always relying upon this aesthetic function, but mostly is using the therapeutic function.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Halyna. And you also keep writing, right? But as you made it very clear in some statements, you keep writing about the current Russia's assault since 2014. And it was quite crucial, quite important to remember that the war started back in 2014. And in fact, the poetry which is collected in this book is very prophetic in many sense, although some of those poems were written back in 2014. So would you talk a little bit about how your writing changed over these past 8 years in particular?
It's interesting to reflect upon that not as an author, but as the person who is working with literature and other texts, not only mine texts. I noticed a very interesting point, that the earliest poems which were included into this book were written even before the beginning of the war, before 2014. In particular, the poem about the bomb shelter, when the full-scale invasion started, and finally we found ourselves in those bomb shelters. It sounded so realistically that people thought that it was written instantly after the events have happened. That is weird and really strange where this war emerged from in my poems. Maybe it was some kind of poetic premonition, or maybe it was the attempt to analyze, to mention these internal feelings and the maturing of these thoughts which existed within me. I do remember that the first poems, the poems which emerged after the Revolution of Dignity, after Maidan and during Maidan events, which emerged during the first months of this conflict in the east of Ukraine, has outgrown and grew into the war. They were a bit different in that different sense. They were unusual for me, for my manner. I was trying to search for the language which would be speaking very directly and precisely, because even then I understood that metaphorical language, lexicon, the language where the speech where I was just using and playing with words, the language where I was even using the Baroque manner when I was trying to play with some idioms, to disassemble them in several parts, where I pay more attention to the language. This language was not working here anymore. I had to find a different form, and this form was rather brutal. It deprived the language of metaphors, epithets, and allusions in the texts, and it happened that during these times my new lexicon has been shaped during these 9 years. And I can see that when we unfortunately reached this moment, the 24th of February, the full-scale invasion, when all of that started for the whole Ukraine, because before that the war existed only for the people who were on the territories where the war was taking place in Donetsk and Luhansk regions, or the people who were involved in those events. My husband was at war, and I came there as a volunteer, so for me it was the war which I saw from the close distance, and I had the need to share these impressions with the people in Ukraine who were really distant from this war. who did not even imagine what is taking place there. So when the full-scale invasion started, our experience and understanding of the war became equalized because the war came to different territories as well, and we all got to know what it is. And it has been reflected in my poetry as well, in a more specific manner. There was no need to speak in some poetic formulas. I could afford myself just to register this emotional fact. And I mentioned for myself that this was the poetry of emotional fact.
I would like to go back to your comment about how distant some parts of Ukraine were in terms of emotions and in terms of understanding what was going on in the Donbass from those events that were taking place in the east of the country. And I would like to put this in the context of the current events and of this current brutal attack of Russia against Ukraine. I wonder if anything changed in terms of your experience of speaking with the international community about the war in Ukraine, which was initiated by Russia. I remember reading one of your interviews in which you mentioned that you were really taken aback by the fact that in the West, for instance, people would be more sympathetic toward what the Russian people are going through today, rather than being sympathetic with all those brutalities and atrocities that are shaping the lives of Ukrainians today. And one of your arguments was that the West is probably more tolerant to these ideas of reconciliation and collaboration, cooperation, even in the midst of atrocities. So what's your experience in terms of how the audiences are perceiving this information about the atrocities in Ukraine initiated by Russia?
Я пригадую
I
вперше.
remember that I faced abroad this misunderstanding or the lack of understanding of the situation which is taking place in 2014 in the north of Italy, in the city of Lano, when I had a meeting with the readings, and those were, it was June or July when the Russian tanks were going in columns to Ukraine. Of course, I couldn't help mentioning about this during my meeting about poetry, and I had a huge misunderstanding with the moderator who said, "We are here speaking about poetry. Poetry is about eternity. It shouldn't speak about the war. And let us not speak about that. Russia has nothing to do with that. You are just deceiving us. Russia is Tsvetaeva, Akhmatova, and other authors." At this moment, I was really impressed. All of this discussion has led to the fact that poetry exists in some pure aesthetic vacuum, that it does not touch any reality, though in fact, even in the fates of the above-mentioned Russian poets, the edge of poetry was the cruel reality, which was the obstacle for them and deprived them of lives, and was the obstacle to write. So poetry doesn't have the right to close its eyes towards reality. We cannot be limited and restricted by the perspective where we can see only aesthetically beautiful and perfect points. That's again some kind of... It's not my approach to poetry. I consider that real poetry concerns all of the spheres of life, and also that it cannot just shut its eyes to what is happening close by and what depends on poetry. Poetry should change it as well. So after that, gradually, when the full-scale invasion started, it has become much easier to explain those points because they have become obvious for the majority, because it wouldn't be that easy to refuse or to cancel the reality, the video recordings, what was shown in the news, and it was harder to ignore this reality. So I remember that even during all of the meetings abroad, and I had approximately 20 of them during the last year in different countries and different continents, I had to answer the question about, in fact, why we have this distrustful attitude towards Russians who are for peace. Well, because in fact, somehow we always had to balance that the Russians are for peace, are the liberal, kind-hearted, good Russians who fled from Russia, who are against Putin's policy, but we somehow are not for peace. Because it's very hard to be for peace when your country is under tanks, when you are being killed and murdered, and when the statement that you are for peace does not change anything. So from my perspective, and in fact it is shared by lots of Ukrainian artists now, all of those dialogues with Russian culture and Russian artists have to be postponed till the times, until the war is over at least, until we are in the equal conditions. Because in fact, here we can see a huge hypocrisy hidden when we are shown in our attempts to protect ourselves as really militarized and interested in war. But we are not interested in war, we are interested in self-defense, because we don't have any other option. Because if we stop protecting ourselves in this situation, for Ukraine it means disappearing or vanishing. And one more important point I emphasizing all the time, the war is changing people. Living in the Ukraine during this more than a year, during the period after the beginning of full-scale invasion, the majority of Ukrainians are in the constant traumatization situation, let alone the artists who were killed or perished, who were captured, who were tortured. So all of that is the reality where we exist, and we cannot just in this reality just say, I don't want to see that, and it will stop existing. That is why all of those discussions, all the attempts to combine Russian and Ukrainian authors in the international platforms and festivals, and to get assurance that they are ready to reconciliate, is, I would say, well, it's a huge mistake. It's a huge misunderstanding which we face abroad, and I am grateful to all of the people who understand that why it shouldn't be done.
Well, in this context, I would like to read out loud a couple of lines from your poem, No War. You standing with a no war sign as if to redeem the inevitable. This war can't be stopped. Like bright arterial blood from an open wound, it flows till it kills. It enters our cities with the armed men, seeps into our courtyards with that reconnaissance units. Like the deadly mercury beads you can't pick up. You can't fix this except to find and neutralize it. These civilians, managers, clerks, IT guys, and students, life didn't prepare them for street fights, but the war did. On the front line, a landscape so familiar it hurts. In a hurry, at first they only recruit experienced combat fighters to the defense units after the gamers who played Dune and Fallout and had a crash course in Molotov cocktails from bartender at the local club while the kids slept. And the kids were crying. The kids were being born into a world temporarily unfit for all this. Out on the playground, they are assembling Czech hedgehogs and nuclear families mix deadly drinks. And then the end of the poem is very powerful. War kills with the hands of the indifferent and even the hands of idle sympathizers. So I would like to follow up with another question about this possible reconciliation. As you pointed out that for right now, the dialogues that would take place between the Ukrainians and the Russians should probably suspended, should probably should be paused at this moment. And when these conversations do take place, I'm thinking about what it will take to reconcile, what will it take to start making steps toward forgiveness, because here it should be a two-way movement, right? It's not just Ukrainians being forgiving, but it's also about the Russians who should be able to ask for that forgiveness. And I'm thinking about Willy Brandt's kneeling that was so significant for this political right reconciliation. But I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this possibility of Russia, in fact, asking for forgiveness, and what will it take for Russia to ask for forgiveness? Because if that doesn't take place, I really have very little hope that some profound reconciliation can take place.
Ну, напевно, мені б легше було.
Well, maybe it would be easier for me to answer if I'm a politologist or if I'm a military, but this is not the sphere of a poet. In this sphere, in this surface, just to speak how this reconciliation should take place. The first thing, I don't see any ways to speak about that, about any opportunities of any reconciliation before the end of the war. I do not see, as well as the majority, any wishes from Russia to acknowledge their fault in this war. It does not exist. The rhetoric which Russia expresses in this situation is totally aggressive, and in fact, it defies the existence of Ukraine as it is. So in all these situations, until Russia has full failure, until it is defeated, it won't be ready to the moment of the acknowledgement. Even acknowledgement of the defeat does not guarantee that Russia would be ready for reconciliation with Ukraine. These are very hard and complicated issues, and in reality, I do not see even any preconditions for those conversations about reconciliation. On the other hand, I'm worried when we try to solve that in the cultural sphere, because they try to reconciliate us with those Russians who, for instance, disagree with Putin's politics and who fled or left from Russia. But in fact, this part of Russians in Russian politics and in politics which provides Russia, nothing depends on them, in fact. So any conversations are held for the beyond. This is the export option of Russian culture, culture for export, which does not play its role in Russia, within Russia, if it did not impact the situation and could not play its role in Russia. And very often those messages of Russian authors from abroad are never disseminated within Russia. Even some underground, as it used to be, as it existed during the times of dissidents, some kind of options which could exist. I understand that in this situation, we are too far from any idea of reconciliation and reconnection. I think that the preliminary, we need to at least get into the situation of survival for Ukrainians, because there is no guarantee that we will survive in all of this long-term conflict, and it looks like a long-term conflict. This war does not look
завтра.
like one
Вона
which should be over tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. It already took lots of lives, and the price that we are paying as the country, as the society, and as the culture is incredibly high, because such a big number of people have already perished who could be creators in culture, in literature, science, art. They could do something incredible, but they will never do that. This is the huge, in fact, abyss or emptiness which is waiting for us in this sphere. So I don't consider that the conversations about reconciliation are reasonable now without any actions which would at least witness that Russia acknowledges
коли, власне,
its fault. And I'm amazed, I'm surprised when Russian liberal politicians in the West are speaking about some, I would say, steps, or how they assess them, steps for reconciliation, because they do not impact, they do not influence this policy. They cannot change or shift the situation. They cannot even influence for us not to be killed. So how can we speak about reconciliation?
Yeah. I would like to talk a little bit more about surviving today and surviving in the future as well, because as your poetry collection also makes it quite obvious, those traumas that are being inflicted today will have to be dealt with afterwards, and probably they will be causing even more pain than they do right now. And part of this surviving today is also this experiencing different emotions and different feelings. And anger is part of this surviving mode, I would say, to some extent. I would like to also read out a couple of lines from another poem, God, Don't Quiet the Voice of Anger. God, don't quiet the voice of anger, the voice of those who sit forgotten in shelters, the voice of those who remain in the debris, the voice of those who scream falling asleep, the voice of those who can't close their eyes, the voice of those who are speechless, mute, who stutter, the voice of those who are dying of thirst and hunger, the voice of those who gather bravery's crumbs, the voice of those whose bodies stopped the columns, who threw themselves between the bullets and the defenseless, the voice of the one howling, calling out in the emptiness, the one who curses, who hides her face in grief, in her child's body, in her son's photo, in her mother's things, in stooped shoulders, in trembling old knees, the voice of a burnt out house, the voice of blood, the voice of reason that's begun to doubt itself, the voice that drowns out sirens, the rocks, the yet unborn, and the nameless. Let it emerge from the throat choked with fear, from the body that will turn to dust, from the city under fire, from the heart that will beat for us all from now on. God, hear it, the voice of hatred in a world where the voice of love can do so little. Well, thank you so much for this poem. And going back to my initial question about surviving, when speaking to international audiences, I find it particularly difficult to talk about these specific emotions, about anger, about hatred, because these emotions are part of what Ukrainians are going through right now. But these emotions make the those who are not directly impacted quite uncomfortable. But I'm wondering how one can deal with these emotions, and what are these emotions telling us about what we're living through in the first place, and how we communicate these emotions to others so that we are not misinterpreted.
від самого початку
Since the very beginning of the full-scale invasion, I can see that every time we have more and more experience, which is much more difficult to communicate for the people beyond, that we have this internal and external messages, and they are substantially different. because the person who is under the situation of the trauma, it can be explained by any psychologist, in fact, is using anger as the way of self-preservation. So the situation of anger appears for the person as a personality to stay in its wholesome state, for him or her to preserve himself or herself, his or her dignity in the situation which is constantly traumatizing.
Більшості таких
So, in the majority of such Ukrainian experiences, which took place in our lives since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, all of those atrocities in Bucha, Rostomel, other Kiev towns, all the experiences and video recordings which we are still getting, and of public executions and other awful crimes, and digging up the burials and mass gravings where we can see those innocent people, killed children, and whatever is happening in our reality, all of that in the Western understanding is getting into this kind of a blurred version, because it gets in a separate cruelty and atrocity beyond the civilized world, beyond these limits. So it turns out that the civilized world is saving itself from the vision, from the seeing of this cruelty. But this world cannot save us for this cruelty not to take place. So all of this escalation of this internal anger which we are piling up is connected with the reality which we are living through. And I noticed that it is so hard, especially for the victims of those awful crimes. They just cannot tell about their experience. For instance, I remember the children who, going along the road or full of dead bodies because they were leaving from the occupation, they explained and described this experience as if it happened with them like in the children's game. This is how our psyche is getting protected. We are not ready to perceive such level of cruelty and atrocity without veiling it, without blurring it. So I'm thinking about that for a long time, how we can tell about that. Literature allows us to tell about that where the pictures are being blurred or the videos are being blurred. Literature has those tools and means which are telling indirectly, but to some extent in the artistic way, they can get through this framework and create the perception and impression about what is taking place, and it can be even much stronger than the visual image. So this is the strength, the power of art during the war, because it allows us to speak and to describe what we cannot show on the pictures, because they are, I would say, inflicting pain, they can hurt, but still it is hard for me sometimes to understand that people are not ready to perceive that all of that is taking place in our reality, that it really is not some imaginary film or movie, that it is not just dense emotions, but that is happening with us in real life. And the picture of the world which we are seeing now is reflected in what we are writing about and how we are feeling this world. And here we can see a huge abyss, a huge gap. I do remember that in one of the previous questions you said why it is easier now to be sympathetic to Russians who are against Putin's policy or who are now in the forced emigration, who had to flee from the country, because this situation in the West is much easier to be imagined by common people than to imagine the situation when they can become the victims of some massacre, or to find themselves in the mass graving, or to become victims of some atrocities under occupation or in the capture or being tortured. So the human brain is not ready to perceive such cruelty difficulty where we are now living in. And this is the biggest mischief of ours. This is the hardest task to explain that.
In one of your interviews, you also mentioned that you believe that probably the best piece of literature about the Russian war against Ukraine will be written by a non-Ukrainian writer. And please correct me if I'm wrong. This is one part of my question. And another one, another part of my question will be about, of course, literature as well. And you keep writing, and other Ukrainian poets and writers keep writing. But as you pointed out, and others also pointed out, that right now this writing is different, of course, for obvious reasons. And maybe it's very straightforward. It's like documenting what's going on right now. And of course, it takes time before we can process on a more metaphorical level, right? What is going on and how we would like to talk about this. And of course, this comment made me think about Volodymyr Vinnychenko, who also was witnessing the First World War, and who also made a comment in his letters that he was not able to write when he was in the middle of that kind of experience. So maybe just a couple of comments in terms of how literature will respond to this experience in the future, and why you believe that probably the best work about Russia's war in Ukraine will be written by a non-Ukrainian writer. But again, if I'm wrong, well, I apologize, and just correct me if I'm wrong.
Так, я пригадую цю фразу.
Yes, I remember this phrase. I think, well, I know that it was connected. I remember the idea which led me to this phrase. The majority of us, in our experience, in the perception of the reality of the war, especially the ones who are at the front line or directly are taking care about the ones
І
who are at the
травмовані
front line,
цією війною.
all the people who lost someone and are traumatized by this war, all the people who used to be under occupation and lived through it. The majority of those people are very close to the reality of this war. And when you are close, you can see just a fragment of this reality, some fraction. You can take something of this reality, some detail, some just little tiny detail which you would never see without the direct contact with the war. You can see some painful pile of material which would be just the part, the component. You don't even understand that it's your experience. You will just understand that this is the fragment of war which you are contacting with. But in comparison with that, to make it out of this bloody material, to make literature out of this painful point, not every person has the opportunity in Ukraine to do that. Not every person has the internal resource for that, because they say that when the person is in the situation of survival, all the strengths, internal and psychological resource, is focused on the processing of the signals of danger, which he or she gets from beyond. The person who is worried or excited doesn't have internal resource for being creative, for generating of some different reality, artistic reality, which can emerge from the material what he or she really sees. So far, the Ukrainians who are in the situation of the war, who are located here, don't have the opportunity to be a bit more distant, to get away for the proper distance, to see it in a wholesome manner. So I think that the big scaled palette or picture about the war will not emerge in Ukraine. It will emerge a bit later, but it can appear abroad. For instance, even among the Ukrainians who can see and observe it from afar, but who are involved emotionally in all of those events, who can analyze different sides of what they see. or by the people who are really delving deeper into this reality, who can focus upon it, and who will have the toolkit to think through this war. I mean that every war needs its toolkit. Every war is different, and even the experience of the Balkans War does not allow the Ukrainian literature to use this experience and somebody's artistic experience to describe our reality. So in fact, for Ukrainians, this war is the first war which is taking place in Ukraine as a separate country, as a state. All the previous wars were taking place on the territory of Ukraine, but they were not wars of Ukraine. And this is a totally different reality. The majority of the previous wars, in particular of the 20th century, which took place on the territory of Ukraine, were not thought through and were not fully reflected in the Ukrainian literature. There was this lack of this bigger canvas. There were only separate literature works which were trying to use some of the reality, but they did not exist at the literature level because of the objective circumstances, because if it existed in diaspora, it was literature which was not accessible in Ukraine during the Soviet period. So all of that was not well thought through, and it was not this experience which we lived through. So in fact, we found out ourselves that we are in the situation that we need to invent the lexicon, the language, the toolkit. We need to search for ways how to overcome certain ethical issues, because there are some materials which we cannot work with, because this is very painful material which is triggering us and triggering lots of people and risks to re-traumatize them. So here, with how we are working on the war in Ukrainian literature within Ukraine, we still have lots of unsolved issues, which lead to internal discussions on a permanent basis, whether you can work with this material, whether you can make it creative and literature work. Can you write about Bucha without having the experience of living in the occupied Bucha? Can you speak about something which you did not live through but only read about? And there are lots of questions which we still have to in the society and in literature which we have to solve for ourselves. That is why my ideas and thoughts that this text will emerge beyond Ukraine have already some confirmation already, because during the last year, lots of texts about the events in Ukraine appeared, and sometimes they are even more disseminated than what the Ukrainian authors are ready to write about.
I would like to conclude our conversation with another poem of yours. And I'm very curious about your comments on this poem, because I had a very strong response to the poem, because it made me relive that sense of hopelessness back in 2014 when the initial invasion started, and how hopeless and how much helplessness I was also experiencing when trying to explain to international audiences that Russia was actually committing some international crime by occupying the Crimea. So this poem is: we act like children with our dead. We act like children with our dead. We place them together on the Maidan and encircle them, in the cold, in the snow, confused, as if none of us knew until now how easy it is to die. Everyone still hopes they'll lie there for a while and rise again. Because what do we tell their mothers? Who will tell them the worst? A person runs toward a bullet with a wooden shield and a warm heart, head in a blood-filled sky helmet, shouting, "Mama, I'm wearing a hat," into the dead receiver. "Mama, this hat's too thin," the bullet hisses.
Very often I did not consider it to be a poem at all. I thought that it was a kind of an emotional response, a shout out, the shout out for help. It was something different than the poetry in the usual sense, because I also consider that altogether poetry does not owe anything to anyone. It shouldn't be like usual poems. But when the events in Maidan happened, when we faced the situation that democratic, I would say, non-violent protests were finalized with the deaths, which were shown live, and the whole world could see it. And when we faced the response, the reaction that the international institutions turned out to be helpless to somehow respond that. I remember I was really impressed by this incapability of the civilized world to stop violence, the incapability to change, to intrude, to change the situation. Because in fact, all of those first blurred pictures were the pictures and videos, those were the videos and pictures of that time. And this poem has become one of the few to describe this picture at Maidan.
чином, який не аудиторія на Фейсбуці. І Фейсбук, до
And
речі,
the audience in Facebook, by the way, Ukrainian Facebook of Maidan times played significant role for the alternative dissemination of information,
була
because the official media were not on Maidan's side. They
контактів
made
і
all of those opportunities to contact with each other.
протести.
So we were speaking about what was taking place. Maybe it's not my usual way. I do not consider that poetry must play such an important and applied
Нам не залишали.
role, but it was the forced situation. We didn't have any other option. So for me, then, I was always asked whether we were heard then, whether they heard our message. To some extent, it seemed to me that they heard us when, during the 5th anniversary of Maidan events, Donald Tusk, who was the head of European Parliament, came to Ukraine and read and quoted this poem in his speech in the Ukrainian Parliament, Verkhovna Rada. And then we got acquainted with him, and we talked for a long time about this poem and why he chose it. I do remember that I had an impression that it's not that hopeless, that the situation may change, that in fact we just need to try to speak. And I had this feeling that we need to try to speak. It still exists, this feeling. Because as a poet, as a writer, I don't have any other tool. I can only speak, I can only write. I am not taking the arms in my hands. I don't take the weapons. I understand that the literature deals with reality in a different way, and it stops wars in a different way. It works in the preventive way. But as the war has already started, literature has to do something with this situation, with what is taking place now. So I don't know whether this is the right way to choose. I'm always in doubts because, well, because on the one hand, it seems to be very long and not that efficient, but still it is doing something. And I do hope that this book will at least explain to many of the people, it could explain some of the details of our reality and what we are feeling in the situation of war. It will explain what, for instance, we cannot show in a different way, what we cannot make you delve deeper into this reality. We can't give you the chance to take this role for each of us in Ukraine and to see that with our eyes, with our feelings, with our emotions. At least I would really like this book to work like this. I don't know whether I would like to read this book again after the war, whether I will have this wish to come back to it, whether I will be able to forget about it. But now I need it, and it is needed by many those who would like to understand something about this war.
Thank you so much, Pani Halyna. And I don't have any doubt that this collection will help the international audiences to better see the Ukrainian perspective on Russia's war against Ukraine. Thank you so much for your powerful words, and thank you so much for this conversation today. Thank you, Pani Halyna. I would also like to say thank you to our interpreter, Yuri Mazur. And again, thank you so much for listening to this interview. Please visit the Arrowsmith website for more information about Halyna Kruk's poetry collection, a crash course in Molotov cocktails translated by Amelia Glaser and Yulia Ilchuk. Thank you so much.